I'm Suzanne Carpenter. I'm from Plainfield Township. I belong to the Plainfield Township Historical Committee, and we are north and slightly east of Grand Rapids. Our board talks about the little village of Plainfield, which basically started in the late 1830s and was completely gone by around 1920. It was below the bluffs of the river, the Grand River, and in our village, we're talking Plainfield Village, the Grand River reaches its highest geographical point in the state of Michigan. It doesn't go any higher than Plainfield Township, and it comes in at the lower eastern corner of the township, makes a big swing, cuts off the top 2/3 of the township, and then proceeds to leave the township at the lower part of Section 31 in the southeast west corner. So it's just a big upside down U that comes through the middle of our township and divides it into two parts. Where the village ended up being started was where a Native American village was. And in fact, where the cornfields for the Native Americans existed, they said this was plain fields and it's being flat, and so that's why it was called Plainfield. Early on, it was the road, of course, for people going to and from any area other than just down the trail to some other cabin. It was the main road. So to get to Grand Rapids, you went downstream, and to get, or upstream actually, you were going upstream, and to get to Walker or some other part, you were going downstream. But there was a problem with this position. It was nice. There was these high bluffs above the river. You could see what was going on, and in fact, the middle picture we selected for our township was the one showing the covered bridge. And the bluffs, the picture was taken from the bluffs above that bridge. But it presented a problem because it wasn't flat. So when all was said and done and other areas were being developed in the township, the railroads and things like that went farther to the west where it was flatter, so they didn't have to deal with the ups and downs, but also so they didn't have to deal with flooding, because that was the other thing that happened here. And so in our first photograph that we chose, you can see that there's a ferry there. And in 1892, down came the Knapp Street Bridge, which had been knocked out in the flood, and it hit the covered bridge, which is our middle photograph, and made it disappear. It ended up, a lot of the wood from that bridge ended up on Grand Island, which is downstream from our bridge's location. And so that's what happened to that bridge. So then they had to use a ferry, which is what you see in the top photograph that shows the abutments to the bridge with nothing on them. And then just to the right of them in the picture, you see the ferry that had to replace that bridge until they put an iron one in around 1900. So from 1892 to 1900, they had to use a ferry because there was no more bridge there, which slowed down traffic quite a bit. And then, of course, the bottom one is a nice peaceful picture of that same covered bridge, looking from the south side of the river to the north side of the river. So that's the little village. Now, because we were the first large settlement north of Grand Rapids, anything that came down from Lyons or Portland came by this bridge. But then when you got to the rapids, you had another problem because you had to take everything off your boat, whether it was shingles or lumber, whatever you were going to do, and you had to walk it 2 miles around the rapids, put it back on a boat if you wanted to get down to Grand Haven. So anybody who was lumbering in Plainfield Township, making shingles or just lath and things like that, they had the expense of taking the stuff off the boat, putting it back on another boat below the rapids, and you lost your profit there. So it was not profitable for them to do a lot of ferrying downriver unless you were a really, really big operation. So that was another problem. But the flooding was probably the worst because the river makes that big swing coming from south to north and back south again. it would flood a lot. And when that would flood, then you'd have houses and businesses all inundated because they were all right there, right on the river's edge. And pretty soon, when roads started getting developed and other means of transportation came along, like first bicycles of all things, and then cars. So by the 20s, they wanted roads, and roads didn't require the river, and so then the river wasn't used very much for transportation, and so a lot of the people who had lived there had just moved away, and you no longer had a village. And by the 20s, it was pretty much gone. There were a few, but there was imagine going from 800 people to nothing in the space of about 60, 70 years. There's nothing there anymore. There used to be a couple of hotels, 3 saloons, I understand, and I got a listing of people who lived there and what their occupations were, and they were barkeeper, or they tended the toll house for the bridge to take the tolls, because that was a toll bridge, and that's what kept it going. And then when you no longer needed the river, then the people moved away.